Okay, Shalom, we're up to chapter 13 in the Tanya, and we are going deeper into the Beinoni. We discussed the Beinoni in last class, chapter 12. We discussed the Rasha in chapter 11, the Tzaddik in chapter 10, and now we're going deeper. It makes sense because the Sefer is called Sefer Beinoni. So this is where we're at. This is what we're striving to be. The tzaddik is described as a yid who is perfectly aligned internally, and therefore obviously his external world, meaning his behavior, is going to be perfect. The Rasha is not perfectly aligned internally, meaning he has desires, he has godly desires, and he also has selfish personal desires. Remember, as we've always said, that the fight always comes down between me and God. There's nothing else. So a person who isn't completely godly means he has desires left for his own selfish, his own self. That's the level internally. So that would be like a Rasha, and then his behavior. If he doesn't behave perfectly, and we explained that can be on a very large continuum from basically constant averas to just the possibility of being able to do an avera. Okay, that would be the level of Rasha. So the level of Beinoni is the level where the person's inner world is divided, meaning he has a strong sense of self. But he also has a strong sense of the Beinoni Shalom. But his behavior is perfect. His primary tool for that is what we said is called Moach Shole Alalev, which is the default way that we got created, which means your mind rules over your heart. And the example we always give is that, or give any example, but a person's about to do something that is not Beseda, and he has a strong time to do it, like he quit smoking for however long and is about to have a cigarette, and someone jumps out the bush and says, here's $1,000 to not smoke that cigarette, and the guy will put the cigarette away. The moyach is always sholet alalev. Okay, we're going to discuss that in more detail right now. So the Beinoni, we're really going to get now into like the mechanics of how it actually works. So it's quite a kind of a nitty-gritty share, but hopefully it will have payers. Okay, so the Beinoni is described as Zeh v'Zeh Shoftan, meaning that in his inner world, he has these two voices. Shoftan, although we translate that as a judge, in English, that means the guy who adjudicates and decides. But in this context, it means more like an orech din, more like a lawyer who puts forth an opinion. So in the Beinoni, you've got two opinions. You've got the opinion of the Yetzer Hara, and you've got the opinion of the Yetzer Tov. And the question is, which way is he going to go behaviorally? And we know the answer to that. The answer to that question is he will go lefi the mitzvah, and he will not go lefi the avera, because he's a Beinoni. That's what a Beinoni is. A person who has a Yetzer Hara, obviously also has a Yetzer Tov, and they're vying. They're both calling what they want, and this person always ends up going with the Yetzer Tov. That's the definition of Beinoni. So this is just such an interesting thing, because the way the Rebbe describes it, the Rebbe writes it in an almost like kind of childish like scenario. The Lashon he uses makes it seem so kind of simplistic and babyish, when if you just translate it into more kind of technical psychoanalytical terms, it's so sophisticated and cutting edge. What we're really going to do now, we have spoken about this in other times, but what we're really going to do now is try and understand the difference between Bechira and Bechira Chofshis. What is free will? What is free will? And why is it called free? So this is the way the Rebbe describes it, okay? And then I'm going to translate it into like modern psychological terms. But the way the Rebbe describes the process is a 5-step process. The Yetzer Hara states his opinion in the left side of the heart. He says, I want to do X, yeah? That message goes up into the brain, and the Nefesh Elokis argues against, and he sends a message back down to the heart, where the Yetzer Tov, who lives in the heart, on the right side of the heart, says his opinion, which is contrary, opposite to the opinion of the Yetzer Hara that was in the left side of the heart. Now they're in this kind of stalemate. It's the same way on either side. And then God illuminates, he shines a light onto the Nefesh Elokis, and the person chooses Tov. That's the way that the Rebbe describes it in the 13th Perek Tanya. So I translated this into like modern psychological terms, okay? I'm going to read what I wrote. You get the notes will be available in the wherever stuff's available. Okay. So number one, the average person, because his principal experience of reality is egocentric, primarily assesses all stimuli on an instinctual, emotional level where one's sense of self is most profoundly manifest. Meaning we look at the world, because we're primarily ego-based, we look at the world through the paradigm of the words, what do I feel about this? That's the Yetzer Hara. That's called the Yetzer Hara. When we look at something, the words that first spring to mind is, what are my thoughts about this? How do I feel about this? That's because we are primarily egocentric, okay? Have you ever thought about how a baby, like sometimes I just, when I go into the mikveh, you go, in the mikveh, you hear, there's all those, like even when you're by yourself in the mikveh, with other people, you'll hear like bubbling and kind of like, there's noises going on in the mikveh, yeah? It's like it's water swishing around and whatever, yeah? So if you go into the mikveh, and one of the most pasha meditations is this meditation of being reborn, meaning you go into your mother's womb, you close up, and that's that pasha thing people do. You ever thought about when you hear those bubbles, or you hear that swooshing, you're like in your mind, like, I wonder what that is. What do you think a baby, a fetus in the mother's womb? What's the fetus in the mother's womb thinking about that beat going on in the background the whole time? Boom, 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 boom. What's the fetus thinking about that? You hear the fetus is hearing that the whole time, and him bubbling and swirling and smushing and all kinds of things. What's the fetus thinking about that?
It's not thinking anything about that. It's just experiencing that.
Exactly. That's called not being in an egocentric world. An egocentric perspective is when you start asking yourself, well, I wonder what that is. What's that about? How does that relate to me? How do I relate to that? Etc. The real experience would be just the experience without thought. We can't even imagine that because our minds are so like that. Yeah, but that would be that's a good meditation when you're in the mikveh, to just be. And it's a good meditation for everything. Don't analyze, don't label, don't compare and contrast and order and just experience. Just experience. Look at a tree and don't put words, don't bombard it with words and previous trees that you've seen and your feeling about, apples and green and wood, and just see the tree. Anyway, so because we're egocentric, we don't do that, and we have an opinion. We have an opinion on X. So now we've had that opinion. Now, if this instinctual emotional impulse is not immediately acted upon, which we do most of the time, it will travel up to the brain where it will be assessed by the emotionless intellect. The intellect will now listen to this opinion that got spat up, or this desire, whatever you want to call it, that got spat up from the heart. yeah, from the ego, so to speak. And it will now process it without any emotion, and a rational opinion as to the validity of this impulse will be rendered by the brain. The brain will make a cheshbon and determine, is this a good impulse or is this a bad impulse? Is this an impulse that I can give into or that I should go with? Or is this an impulse that I have to be oimed against and not give into? Yeah. If it decides the latter, that it decides that it's an impulse that isn't good, then it's going to send back, primarily by way of the endocrine system, some kind of biochemical message that will go back down to the heart, and that will create an opposing desire in the other side of the heart. That's called the Yetzer Tov piping up. It's all chemicals. You could call the chemicals malachim if you want. That's how it is that's how we understand it in this generation. So now we had the original impulse, the egocentric impulse, which said, do it. And then you now, after the brain has decided that that's not the right thing, it now sends back down a message, and we have a contrary impulse that says, don't do it. Now, in this case, if you'll find yourself in an almost kind of catatonic state where you have two equal impulses to do opposite things, and at that point, you can't really do anything. At that point, if you can hold your ground, so to speak, yeah, just basically buy some time, then what will happen is, in a kind of magical, mystical way, your ability to overcome the negative impulse will actually increase, and you will be able to be oimed the nisayon. And I think that is, this is my thoughts, I think that's the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, where it says,
Masunim bedin.
Masunim bedin. The very first thing that Avos says, it says, be deliberate in din. And I think it's really getting at this inyan of Bechir Chofshis, where Bechir Chofshis isn't really something that you do. It's something that happens to you.
Well,
yeah.
It doesn't sound like magical and mystical to me. It sounds like it's the buying of time which cools down the passion of the heart. No?
I don't know I don't think it works like that. I think it's the opposite. It's the asay tov. It's the neshama being allowed its expression through. I think it's more that it's mevatel the taiva, because lav dafka, the taiva could, if you're not giving into something, the taiva could be mischazek b'zman. But I think the inyan of Bechir Chofshis is that the nefesh elokis itself actually expresses herself. That's what's called the light of God shining onto the nefesh elokis. It's the very panemius of the nefesh elokis, the yechida should be yechida, whatever it is, the essence of the nefesh elokis that expresses herself, and that's called Bechira Chofshis. So Bechira is a choice between A and B, and you can make, like we've said many times, the choice Bechira is guided by either intellect or emotion. That's what makes you decide something, Alpi Bechira. Whether it's going to be that your intellect compels you, and your emotion compels you, but that's not called free choice. You're being compelled. Like the example we always give, if somebody offers you a $10 bill and a $100 bill, you're compelled by your intellect to take the $100 bill. That can't be called free will. You're not free. And that's the same with all choices. It's the cheshbon. It's the cheshbon. So Bechira Chofshis is bli cheshbon. It's lemala min a cheshbon, and it's the essence of the soul expressing itself through the reason, through the emotion, whatever it is, and and dominating, so to speak, and winning the battle. Okay, so that's basically how the Rebbe describes Bechira Chofshis. That's really what Bechira is. When it's not, it didn't come down. So it comes out like this: if a person doesn't do an Aveira because he doesn't want to go to Gehenna, that's called a Bechira decision. And that would be comparable to a guy who hires, a wealthy guy who hires some big bouncer to walk around with his son. And every time his son wants to do something that isn't Beseda, the bouncer gives him a clap round the head. That would prevent the son from doing anything wrong. The son would make a cheshbon. Right now, I want to do this, which isn't correct, but I know I'm going to get a clip round the ear if I do that, so I'm not going to do that. That's just called logic. That's called sensible. There's nothing magical or mystical about that. And that's what the Rebbe is trying to tell us, that the Jew is making decisions. The Jew is making Bechira Chofshis decisions, free will decisions, and that means that is Hashem coming down into his world. And that's happening by the Beinoni. That's happening by the Beinoni in Kol Rega V'Rega. Even if you are making cheshbonos in your mind and stuff, it doesn't mean that this process isn't taking place underneath all of the cheshbonos. Okay.
Well, I don't really get how the process works. I don't like it. I feel like if Hashem illuminates the Yetzer Tov, then how is it his decision?
How's it the person's decision?
Yeah.
The person, that's what you just said, basically. The person kind of staves off. He kind of delays doing the actual thing that he shouldn't be doing. And if he can hold his ground and stay in that kind of stalemate position, then that will be enough.
That's the only way to go through it, is to like just be through it and like experience it and
that's the only way. That's the way Bechira Chofshis works. Bechira Chofshis is not this kind of like, I mean, it can be an intense struggle, but just to remain passive, so to speak. You can't do Bechira Chofshis. Bechira Chofshis happens through you. That's why it's the release of the Beinoni Shalom into this world. That's why it's so heilig. That's why it's so heilig. Okay, so let's move on. So we're going to answer up a couple of questions. We answered some questions at the beginning of Tanya. The first question we asked, the very beginning of Tanya, the very first question is, they make you promise that you're going to be a tzaddik and not be a rasha. And if the whole world, he brings from the Gemara, if the whole world calls you a tzaddik, you should be in your eyes like a rasha. Yeah? And then the Rebbe comes along and brings rayas from Mishnah and from Chazal and also from Svara, why it's no good to see yourself as a rasha. So the answer the Rebbe gives in this chapter, 13 chapters later, is that you see yourself ku-rasha, like a rasha, not as a rasha, like a rasha, meaning that you should understand that even if you feel that you don't have any negativity or any selfishness left inside you, you should always be on guard. Like a rasha means you're not a rasha, you're a Beinoni. Your inner world is divided, even if your behavior is perfect. So you shouldn't see yourself as a rasha. You should see yourself like a rasha, meaning a Beinoni who is internally exactly the same as a rasha, but externally behaves perfectly, and that's the difference. So he answers up that question. Then he answers another question.
Meaning you should be meyaches yourself to a rasha as opposed to a tzaddik, even though you're half a rasha and half a tzaddik.
Well, no, he says karasha means like a Beinoni. You're like a rasha, meaning a Beinoni's got much more in common.
A tzaddik just see himself. Beinoni is a Beinoni.
Well, really, a Beinoni is an in between, is the in between level where he has the mahus of a rasha. His inner world is of the rasha, but his external, his behavior is
of a
like
tzaddik.
a tzaddik. So what is he? He's Karasha. He is like a Rasha. His behavior is like a tzaddik, but he is Karasha.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. He should be miyachas himself to the Russia aspect, not the tzaddik. Don't fool yourself into thinking you're a tzaddik. Your mahus goes after your inner world, not your outer world.
Well, not your mahus goes after your inner world. Your mahus is your inner world. So he is Karasha. He's like a Rasha, meaning that his inner world is divided. He's got selfish impulses and selfless godly impulses. So that's Karasha. So don't think of yourself as a Rasha. Think of yourself like a Rasha, meaning your inner world is divided, but your behavior is so you should see yourself as a Beinoni. That's what everybody should see themselves as, that you can reach behavioral perfection. Okay, the second question is really what the whole Sefer is based on, is Rabba Bar Nachmani, who made a Penadika statement, and he was talking to Abai, and he said, "There's Beinonim, there's Rishayim, there's Tzadikim, there's Beinonim. Like me, for example, I'm a Beinoni." And Abai turns around to Rabba and says, "Rabba, if you call yourself a Beinoni, then we're all Rishayim." And the question the Rebbe asks is, how could Rabba Bar Nachmani call himself a Beinoni? He was a tzaddik gamor. He was a tremendous tzaddik, like to the point where the story is he'd never stopped talking Torah. Lo pasik pumi migirsa, and the Malach Mavis couldn't take him bechlal. And he paskin the thing he died. I think in Bava Basra there's the Gemara where he paskin there was a machlokes between Hashem and the what's it called, the Masivta de Rakia, where they were choilek on a certain din and tum and tara, and he died with the word tahara, tahor. He died with the word tahor on his lips. He paskind between a machlokes between the Masivta de Rakia and the Rabbeinu Shloilem. They asked Rabba Bar Nachmani to give psak, and he died with the words tahor on his. That's who he was. He was the biggest of the biggest. He was the biggest of the generation. Tremendous. And he's calling himself a Beinoni. How can that be? So you could just turn around and say, well, he was just lying. He was a tzaddik and he called himself a Beinoni. And this is a big lesson in what humility is. Humility does not include lying. You can't lie. Being humble would mean you would take like the less complimentary option, maybe, but you can't lie. If you're a concert level pianist and somebody asks for a pianist to say, "Well, I don't know how to play the piano," would not be humble. That would be false. So really the Tanya bases its whole philosophy on this, or a big chunk of its whole philosophy on this mimer from Rabba. Rabba said, "I'm like a Beinoni," and he was a tzaddik gamor. So the Rebbe asks, how can it be that a tzaddik gamor could legitimately confuse himself with a Beinoni? And the answer is that if the Beinoni is asuk in Torah and mitzvahs, the Ra inside of him could be silenced to the point where he could actually think that he's a tzaddik. That a person who's constantly involved in Torah and mitzvahs can be in such a state of moichin de gadlus that his kadosh side is so activated and his whole side has become so dormant that he could actually think he's a tzaddik. So Rabbah went the opposite way. Rabbah was really a tzaddik, but he was like pasik pumi megirsa. He never stopped learning. So he said, "You know what? I'm a Beinoni," meaning, you're right. For all intents and purposes, I feel like a tzaddik, but that's just because I never stopped learning for a second. That's because I never let Hashem out of my life for 1 second. I'm consciously being Oved, Kol Rega V'Rega, and I'm choishish that if I would stop my avoiders for 1 moment, the Yetzer Hara would be right back in there, and that's a Beinoni. So he said, like, I'm a Beinoni. That's an amazing chizuk for us. That's an amazing chizuk for us, because if we just keep working hard, yeah, don't let your guard down, keep working hard, dedicate yourself to the Rebbeinu Shloim, and the key to this really, as we've said over and over, says Rabbi Yochanan, halavai shispalo adam kol hayom kuloi. Halavai are meant to daven all day long. Why? Because that's the bechina of a tzaddik. That's a Beinoni. That's how a Beinoni becomes experiences, tastes, pardon me, the madrega of a tzaddik. Tefillah is the primary one. The chiddush of Rabbah was he did it through Torah. That's a bigger chiddush. Tefillah is easier to experience moichin de gadlus than Torah, but Rabbah experienced it dafka through Torah. His Torah was Tefillah. That's like a moiradika. That's a moiradika madrega. But we have got access to these madregas through Tefillah primarily. Yeah, but also Torah, but through Tefillah. And now the Rebbe goes on. We're going to finish the shir on this inyan, which is a moiradika inyan. The concept of MS. What does MS mean? What is MS? So the pasuk from Mishlei says, Svas MS tichoin la'ad, va'ad ariga loshen sheker. The inyan of MS is that it's constant and it's eternal. MS doesn't fluctuate, and MS always is. If it's MS now, it will be MS later. MS is not subject to the winds of anything. MS is always as it is, and it never changes. And at the same time, MS is also relative. Okay, we're trying to explain all of this. Okay, so basically, the Rebbe is concerned with the fact that the Beinoni, when he's davening, he experiences a genuine love for Rebbeinu Shloim. Okay, but then when he stops davening, all his foreign loves come back up, and he is pulled in all these different directions. So the Rebbe is concerned, and the Rebbe says, "Well, that isn't MS, is it? Because MS is svas MS tichoin la'ad. It's forever, yeah. And ad ariga loshen sheker, and sheker is momentary and it fluctuates. So what? So that means that the Beinoni's avodah isn't MS." And the Rebbe answers, no, it is MS. Compared to the avodah of the tzaddik, it's not MS. The tzaddik's emotional state is constant. He's constantly aligned with the Rebbeinu Shloim. The Beinoni's emotional state is fluctuating. Sometimes he's mamash all the way there, sometimes he's mamash not there, goes up and down. So in comparison to the avodah of the tzaddik, it's not MS. However, who's comparing? The metzius of the Beinoni is that this is his struggle. This is his avodah. He has to struggle with this fluctuating inner world. Sometimes he's on fire for God. Sometimes he's not on fire for God. Sometimes he's on fire for other stuff. That's the reality of the Beinoni. That's his MS. So relative to the tzaddik, it's not MS, but relative to himself, in context of who he is and what he was created to be, it's emes la'amitoi. He says it's avodah tama, the emes la'amitoi. It's a perfect service, and it's emes la'amitoi. That's one thing that he says. Then he explains another thing on regards to that. Just he brings a kind of Kabbalah Dika inyan and explains that the feet and the heels of the level above are higher than the moichin and the rosh of the level below. And that's in Avos, it says it's better to be the tail of a lion than it is the head of a fox. Yeah, that's the Inyan, is that accordingly, as it goes down the Madrigas, the highest level of the Madriga below is not as high as the lowest level of the Madriga above. That's this Inyan of a relative concept, a relative level of MS. And then he says another thing that's really important, is that because the Beinoni, it's within his ability to generate these emotions through, he says, proper preparation in davening. Basically, through taking Shachris seriously, the Beinoni has the ability to generate these emotions for the Beinoni Shloim, and therefore he argues that because he potentially can always generate these emotions, that's also called MS. So he finishes by basically saying that the avodah of the Beinoni is MS. We're like, well, who cares? Whatever. He obviously cares because MS is a very important thing. So now, just an interesting side point is the Rebbe's name was Shneur Zalman. So Shneur, his pasuk is Sfas Emes Tichon La'ad Adariga Loshen Sheker. That was his pasuk. So in fact, the only place in Tanya where he mentions himself, he says Hareini. I testify that this Beinoni's avodah is MS. The only time he mentions the word I is here, because this is his pasuk. Okay, I want to spend the last little bit of the shir explaining another concept, which is very interesting. The difference between MS and Metzias. What's the difference in MS and Metzias? So MS, like we said, is constant and always. Doesn't change. MS is MS. Metzias changes. So the way my Rebbe explains it is he talks about truth and fact. There's truth, which is immutable, unchangeable, and eternal. And then there's fact, which is transitory and momentary and fluctuates. So what does it actually mean? So in a sense, you can say that MS is the way that Hashem looks at reality. And Metzias is the way that we look at reality. See, the question is something like this, yeah? Or let's say that we say it another way. MS is how things should and must be. Metzias is how they actually are. Which means Yidden do Torah and mitzvahs. That's the MS. Yidden observe Torah and mitzvahs is true. The fact is, there's a few Yidden who aren't holding by Torah and mitzvahs. That's a fact. But that's not MS. MS is that a Yid does mitzvahs. In fact, the MS is that that's all a Yid does. A Yid is a mitzvah machine. That's all he does. That's all he is. That's his entire Metzias. I'm using the word Metzias as a different concept. That's who he is. That's true. That's really true. The Metzias that we see in the world is that that's not the case. But that's just momentary. That's going to be gone. And you're going to see all the Yidden are going to be mamash, shakur and kashur to Torah and mitzvahs mamash. Because MS has to be. It's like the story of Chanina ben Dosa with his daughter came to him just before Shabbos, you know, the Goren Tainus, and she says, Abba, I put vinegar in the candles. And he says, don't worry about it. The one who said that vinegar should burn, so the one who said the oil should burn, he'll say vinegar should burn. That's also the Inyan of by before Matan Torah, by Kriyas Yamsuf. We had to get to Har Sinai. That's true. That was true. Like the candles had to be lit for Shabbos. That's truth. Yeah. But the Metzias was there was a sea in front of us. So Hashem moved the sea for us. That's the Inyan. That's called a nace. A nace, the definition of a nace is when the metzius of this world that is not in line with truth is moved away, that truth can shine through. The truth is that the Yidden needed to get to the other side of Yam Suf, or however it went round in there, whatever it is, that Yidden needed to go through Yam Suf to get to Har Sinai. That was true. So the Metzius of the sea had to give away. The Metzius of this world will always and eventually bow down to Emes. People understanding this? It's like, how are you behaving? What does your behavior look like? See, sometimes we behave in a way that isn't true to who we are. That will go away. That will finish eventually. The truth of who we are is we're mamash givoldik. We're mamash ovdei Hashem. We're hewn from under the kiseh covered mamash. We're from the highest place in reality. And we will, that will be the Metzius at some point. That's the Geula Shalema. The Geula Shalema is when the Metzius will be completely nullified to the Emes. Right now, we've got Emes and we've got a Metzius that in a lot of ways, in nearly every way, isn't very Emestic. But eventually, we'll see that Metzius will dissolve away or get pushed away, and the Emes will shine through. And that will be, that is what we call Geula, which is, we've said in other words, the expression, when your neshama has expression, true expression, that's called Geula. That's a personal Geula. When you're behaving like a tzaddik is in the Metzius of Geula, meaning his inner world and his outer world are completely in line with each other. Toichoi kaboiroi. That's why it says toichoi kaboiroi, not boiroi katoichoi. Why? You would think it would say that it says that the inner should be like the outer. You would think it should say that the outer should be like the inner. But the inner should be like the outer, because that's when the Metzius has actually bowed itself to the Emes. That the Metzius has become a revelation of the Emes. That the Emes is not, the inner world is not, the inner world has become like the tzaddik, like what it should really be, and it's expressing itself. It becomes manifest like the outer world, like in the Beinoni. Because in the Beinoni, the outer world is perfect, but the inner world needs the tikkun. You with me? So the inyan of Metzius and Emes is the same inyan as Geula, meaning that the external world and the internal world, there should be a free flow. It should all be one. And that's B'yom Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad, that his name and him will be one, which is the inyan of the outer and the inner being together in unison. And that's basically the end of Perek 30. So just very quickly, we said that the Beinoni is of a dual character internally, but is constantly behaving correctly. And just to add another final point, is that it's his behavior, it's his good behavior that helps him behave correctly. That sounds funny, but it's a very, very deep point. Is that, has it ever seen this book called Atomic Habits? Yeah, you read it? Very good book, fantastic book. And the biggest takeaway from that book, for me, the biggest takeaway was that he was saying that if you want to become like a mensch, oh, there you go. If you want to become a mensch, yeah, start acting like a mensch. Because you can, this is exactly this side This is the side of the Beinoni. Is the Beinoni acts like a mensch, even when it's hard for him, yeah, but he acts like a mensch. That feeds back into the system and he starts to identify like a mensch. And that helps him act like a mensch, which makes him identify weiter as a mensch, which helps him act like a mensch. And it's an upward spiral. So the easiest thing that we've got to change, it doesn't feel like this a lot of the time, but really it is the easiest thing that we have to, the thing that's most immediately within our control is our behavior. But the behavior, when we fix our behavior, that relays back in, it feeds back in, and it then helps us identify with that good behavior, which helps us behave correctly, which helps us identify with the good behavior, helps us behave correctly, and we're on an upward spiral, B'ezrat Hashem. Okay, share good news, B'ezrat Hashem. All the craziness in the world should finish. And
Amen.
Amen. Reb Shmuel, can you stay on for 1 minute?
Yeah.